ASMR, my controversial queer opinions. Number 1, people's relationship with themselves and their own identities tend to be more complex than other people's relationships with that person's identity. That is to say, that if someone tells you their identity and you do not understand it, that does not mean that that person is wrong. I promise you that they already knew that their identity may be confusing to other people given the amount of time that people think about identities before committing to identifying as them. In a similar vein, humans, just like all other forms of life on Earth, are highly complex, and the little boxes that we use to put things into are not always going to accommodate for all of the different ways of being. If you know anything about taxonomy, you know that nature does not give anything to you straight, and why would humans be that way? So just because we have these little boxes that we've created does not mean that these little boxes can in any way describe every single human being on the planet. So some people need to resort to more complex ways of explaining and describing themselves to other people for that reason. Language and social dynamics and people are highly complex, so just because something exists with contradiction or nuance does not mean that it does not deserve to continue existing. For example, it is reasonable to expect that there are places for women in the world, that there are places specifically to accommodate for women, but that those spaces also need to include trans women, as the majority of problems that cis women experience are also experienced by trans women. However, this also means that that does not necessarily mean that trans women belong in a gynecologist's office unless they are the gynecologist, but trans women typically are not going into gynecologist offices considering that they do not have female reproductive organs. These two truths can exist at the same time, that there should be spaces for women and that there should be spaces for cis women depending on the context. This also goes for men and trans men. If a child is old enough to know that they are experiencing a heterosexual crush, a child is also old enough to know that they are experiencing a homosexual crush. Similarly, if a child is able to understand that they may identify with their gender assigned at birth, they are also old enough to understand if they do not identify with their gender assigned at birth. Similarly, people's relationships with themselves and their identities evolve over time, just as I would expect that that child's relationship with themselves would evolve as they grow up. Which goes into my next controversial opinion, and that is that in society, in common heterosexual cisgendered society, there are 4 acceptable genders within the gender binary: man, woman, boy, girl. Girls exist in a different social category than women and are expected to perform different expressions of gender than women. This is the same for boys and men. So if a child does all gay or in all lesbian spaces. But I do think that it is not something that should be ignored, that in male-male top-bottom dynamics, it's more about who's taking, and in female-female dynamics, it's more about who is giving or providing. When it comes to who is viewed as more dominant or as the top of the relationship, a lot of people don't like it when trans women come out and then they do a bunch of stereotypically feminine things because they view it as a false perception of femininity, and that is not incorrect. However, that does not